Okay, great. Well, welcome to the Obesity Canada community. This is the Hope series. This series was created to develop a community, to provide knowledge, and of course, to create hope. We have people from all over the world joining us today. In today's audience, we have physicians, dietitians, bariatric educators, nutritionalists, and returning members. This is truly an international community. There's people online today from Iraq, Mexico, US, Canada, and other countries. So I'm Sandra Alia, and I'm the Vice Chair for Obesity Canada GTA. I'm also a food addiction counselor here in Canada. I've sat on the board of Obesity Canada for, as of today, 5 years. 5 years is our anniversary. And this board has given me so much in terms of building relationships, collaboration, and working with some of the top obesity doctors in Canada, if not the world. And today's topic is how is the ongoing pandemic driving obesity and other chronic diseases? So I am going to turn this over to Dr. Arya Sharma, and he is the Professor of Medicine at the University of Alberta and Scientific Director of Obesity Canada. So over to you. Sure.
Well, thanks, Sandra, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody. So as you all know, Obesity Canada is Canada's national registered charity, which is dedicated to improving the lives of Canadians living with obesity. And Obesity Canada does this by supporting research. It trains, educates health professionals, it supports researchers, it mentors a lot of trainees and students, and it also works with policymakers in making sure that all Canadians living with obesity have the same access to prevention and care as anybody living with other chronic diseases like diabetes or hypertension. So welcome to today's topic, where we're going to be focusing on the issue of stress. Now we've got stressful times. I think that's easy for all of us to see. Our lives have changed dramatically for at least for many of us over the past several weeks, and any change can lead to stress. And so I'm very happy that today we've got actually two guests on the show who are both experts in their own right on what stress actually does and what we can actually do to cope with stress. So having said that, I'd like to first introduce you to Derek. Derek, good morning. Now, Derek has a very interesting background. He's someone who's been working sort of both in private practice, but also in the corporate sector with a focus on employee wellness. And he's got a wealth of experience here. He's worked for some of the largest employers in Canada and has done this for many, many years. And he's going to definitely be explaining to us, what it is about stress that is so important and what we can do about it. So Derek, welcome to the show. And maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us a little bit about your background and your interest in this topic.
Sure. I guess my interest, well, first of all, I'm a chiropractor and an acupuncturist. And I always had an interest in corporate wellness almost from the time I graduated. And private practice was interesting, and it still is, but once you're in a corporate environment, it just changes things quite a bit. The impacts on the environment, on the employees are quite different than they are at home, of course, and in private practice. And I've been to many different corporations in general, but the trends are always the same in the workplace. And I've developed a practice based upon trying to reduce the impact of the environment on the person in terms of their stress levels, because the top three stressors are always going to be work, finances, and family. And those three variables you can't change pretty quickly. So my focus has been trying to develop protocols that are more focused on internal environments in terms of stress chemistry, inflammation levels, and I use that approach quite a bit.
So Derek, if I can ask the question, how has the COVID situation affected your own day-to-day life? I mean, do you work out of an office? What's going on with your practice? What has really changed in the last couple of weeks for you?
Well, I was forced into retirement pretty early, about 3 months ago.
Oh.
And because we had to shut down all the clinics, of course. And the first 2 weeks were pretty interesting because it seems that whole planet was put on pause at that particular time. And I found that the first 2 weeks, myself and my practice, we started to transition to virtual care at that point. And I started to develop tools that were quite interesting because instead of hands-on, it was much more verbal and much more visual. And in terms of assessing patients, I basically developed questionnaires and that type of thing to try and break down symptom inventory and the effects of stress on those particular individuals. But personally, after those 2 weeks, I had so much time on my hand. I started to sign up for online programs just to stimulate my brain more. And the more and more the weeks went on and the months went by, it was a great time for me personally, because it gave me a different perspective on what I wanted to do over the next few years, which you would never really get because you're constantly working typically, right? So for me, it was a good thing. And I hope to transition that into the future.
So thanks, Derek, for that quick intro. I'd also like to bring into the conversation Rachel. So Rachel also has a very interesting background, and she's going to tell us about it. But Rachel, I want to dive right in there. So in your situation, you went from working in a corporate office to working at home even before COVID. So you've actually done this transition before anybody else. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and then tell us about what that experience was like.
Absolutely. So my name is Rachel Atkins, and I am the Director of Strategy with the Toronto chapter of Obesity Canada. And, as you mentioned, I've actually been working in the corporate world in strategy and business transformation for about 25 years. And for the majority of that time, I was working out of an office tower. So if I wasn't in an office tower, I was actually on a plane flying to somewhere else in the world. And then I kind of went independent. So, I've been working on contract, and I had the luxury about a year ago of figuring out, how do I go from working in an office to working from home? So I was able to make that transition, and sort of then uncovered what were the really meaningful things for me that I needed to make sure that I had in my space, in my home office. So that was a really good transition. And I realized that I was lucky. There's many people now that have been very abruptly forced to go from an office tower to a home office. And that has, certainly a whole bunch of new challenges added in.
Now, if I can be so open, I mean, you've been living with, let's say health challenges for quite a while, if you want.
Yeah.
And how did this transition actually affect your stress levels and your working for things? Were there positive things, and were the negative things that you could, perhaps talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the transition that I made the year ago to working in a home office, I also was working on new eating habits at that time, because I have lived in a larger body for most of my life since childhood. And I've gone through, I'm an expert dieter, but I've given up that bad habit, thankfully. So yeah, I've had to go through that transition and work through a new eating style once I started working from home. And then certainly if we think about the current time, right, the abrupt transition to all of a sudden being kind of stuck at home. I live in a condo, really small condo, downtown Toronto. So I haven't had even some of the luxuries that folks that might be living in homes that have a backyard have. And so some of the challenges that, that I've experienced over the last little while is certainly 100% for me. It's the lack of connection with other human beings. But I think, as Dr. Lee has mentioned, I've actually noticed that there's been a lot of positive things about being stuck in my small condo and in my small home office. I feel like my entrepreneurial juices have been on high, and I've been thinking about new business opportunities and things like that. So I think there's been good things, but that certainly come with, some challenges. And one thing, might be thinking from a food perspective, pandemic foods, top of the list, potato chips. And how do I not bring those into my home? So I've been working through some challenges, but also enjoying my home office space.
So Derek, before we dive, more into the whole issue around, isolation and stress and what it does to your body, can you perhaps, quickly take us through the science of stress? What is stress? How do we define it? What does it actually do to your body? And why is stress such an important factor, in people's everyday life, but also particularly for people who are living with some kind of chronic condition or some kind of chronic health problem? What is it about stress that makes it so dangerous?
Well, the vast majority of chronic illnesses are affected directly or at least indirectly by inflammation. And one of the top producers of inflammation is chronic stress. Now,
let's get this straight. When you use the term inflammation, what are we talking about? What do you mean by inflammation?
Good question. So inflammation is basically an immune response. Most of us will kind of conceive or think about inflammation as, if you hurt your knee, it gets swollen, gets irritated, that's inflammation. It's a good thing when it happens because it protects us against it getting worse. Same thing, the same immune reaction happens if there's an infection by a pathogen, a virus, or a bacteria. Inflammation is launched to deal and kill that pathogen or to remove the damaged tissue if there's an injury. And once that resolves, that basically takes care of that situation. The problem becomes more problematic when that inflammation response is either too high or too low for an extended period of time. And that's typically when chronic diseases and illnesses develop. And now stress is on the top of the list, I would say, in terms of producing that chronic inflammation state because it does drive inflammation processes.
And if you give me a specific example, because this is Obesity Canada, we talk about obesity here. So and there's quite a lot of data showing that in fact your fat cells themselves produce a lot of pro-inflammatory factors. So you can actually see that even if you're growing fat cells in a test tube, you can actually show that those fat cells are making molecules that will actually cause systemic inflammation. But when you talk about stress in that situation, it's someone who's maybe already living in a body where that's producing a lot of these molecules. Is there something that we should be knowing about or that we should be aware of that is specific to that situation? So we've got someone living with diabetes, we've got someone living with maybe obesity, maybe chronic arthritis, and then and on top of that, now you've got isolation and you've got all this, as you said, the financial worries, the worries about family, jobs, and all of those other things. So what then happens? Does all of this just come together and everything gets worse, or how do you think about this?
Well, I think it's important that if we talk a little bit about the stress response, then we'll get into how it relates to insulin resistance, weight gain, and inflammation. Basically, the way it works is that when we're faced with a stressor, our brain releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, and that actually controls inflammation. So on the one half, you have the sympathetic nervous system, which is the gas pedal for the inflammation engine, okay? And that's commonly known as the fight or flight response. When that happens, that increases inflammation so we can fight off any stress impact. On the flip side, the brake of that of the engine is the release of cortisol, and cortisol is anti-inflammatory in nature. If you have one single stress event, the gas and the brake are pressed at the same time, so inflammation is controlled and moderated. Unfortunately, if you're under chronic stress, what happens is that cortisol becomes, just like insulin resistant, as any hormone does, it becomes cortisol resistant as well. And that removes the brake from the inflammation engine. So the gas pedal is constantly being pushed. We overproduce inflammation for extended periods of time. And that's what leads to chronic illness. Now, in terms of obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, increased inflammation levels produce insulin resistance, which leads to uptake or increase in adipose tissue. Now, adipose tissue has also been kind of compared to an endocrine organ on its own, because it does produce inflammation products like NF-kappa beta, TNF-alpha, which are inflammation chemicals, and that feeds back into a loop of inflammation. So you have inflammation, insulin resistance, adipose tissue, and more inflammation. And that's what happens chronically.
Okay, so you've nicely explained the relationship between stress and inflammation, and insulin resistance, which is a huge factor in all of this. But let me talk a little bit about I want to pick your brains on maybe some of the psychological effects of stress? I mean, what happens, how do you respond in a stressful situation? And the big question, of course, is why is it that in some people, stress goes pretty much hand in hand with cravings that are hard to control. And for other people, the exact opposite happens. Some people, when they have stress, they stop eating, and in fact, they lose their appetite. So how do we think about that? Is there a way to say, for who is stress something that drives appetite, and for who is, stress something that might actually kill appetite and ruin appetite, if you want? And why is eating a coping strategy for stress? I mean, how does that happen? Can you explain those links?
For sure. And a lot of that is a mirror of the cortisol levels and the cortisol resistance in terms of appetite, sedation, and that type of thing. So once again, when inflammation is high, when cortisol is elevated as well, that tends to increase our cravings. We don't fill up in terms of when we eat, and we kind of have this attitude in terms of we tend to be grazing throughout the day. And don't forget that when we have the effects of stress, the top 3 results of high cortisol are always going to be, it blocks our ability to get into deep sleep states. So we start to have issues with fatigue, brain fog, lethargy. So of course we're going to crave any kind of sugars or carbs because that's going to boost our energy levels, right? Now the second effect, of course, is inflammation with cortisol as well. And the third is typically weight gain. And as you know, you almost have to eat a third less calories when cortisol is high just to maintain your current weight.
Right. So Rachel, over to you again. I mean, you probably experienced some of these, perhaps both the psychological and the physiological effects of isolation and the stress that comes in it. What has been your personal experience, and how have you been dealing with some of those issues?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that Dr. Lee, I wish I had access to someone with your knowledge and your ability to so eloquently explain it. It certainly describes, I can think of some very specific examples that really marry well with how you explained how the whole thing works, with the stress and then the eating habits and things like that. So I would say that, what I have been able to do for myself, as I mentioned, it's been about a year now that I transitioned to working from home. And, so I have a lot of friends right now that, for the friends that I have that I still have a job at the moment, and I realize that some people are not necessarily in that fortunate position, but for those that are now working from home, I've actually had some friends coming to me and saying, how can I set myself up for success at home? I'm snacking all day and it's been really difficult, and I'm just kind of stressed out about the whole thing, because one of the stressors that I think is really important to consider right now is that employers, at least there's a sense that employers are actually having higher expectations of people that are working from home, because there's this concept that you still have a job, you should feel lucky for that. So I think that there's a whole bunch of additional stresses now as people have had to move home. So I'll just quickly mention 3 things, and happy to go into detail on any of them. But I find the 3 things that work for me and the 3 things that I've been sharing with my friends. One is to set myself up for success. So from the moment I go to the grocery store, those precious grocery store visits now, there's a lot less of them and they're a lot more complicated. But when you do go, don't bring home those highly palatable, highly engineered foods, because if they're in your house and you're working from your house, it's much more accessible and you may go in that direction. If they're not there, it's easier. You're going to make your life easier. The second thing I would say is have a dedicated office space. So I live in 600 square feet. You can probably see that my couch is right behind me. So my office is in my living room and my kitchen is just behind that. But I have managed to carve out a space that's dedicated to my office and to doing work. And that's been really, really important because that's also a space that I have set up as a no food zone. So there's, certainly some times when I might be having dinner with a friend or family over Zoom, but for the most part, I don't have snacks here. I don't allow my brain to associate the fact that I'm sitting down with having food and snacks in this particular environment. So I found that really helpful. And then the final thing I would mention is rituals. So just, if it's that you really love soda water, the soda water that's not riddled with chemicals and sugar, but if you really like soda water, enjoy the soda water instead of going for that, salty, sugary snack. Take time out, set your alarm for 10 o'clock in the morning, take time out to play with your cat or go for a walk with your dog or have a socially distanced coffee with a neighbor. So I think that having rituals in your day also is extremely important. So, from my perspective, those three things have been really helpful to not only, transfer to working from home, but certainly to deal with a lot of the stress that's happening right now.
Yeah. So Derek, your background has been, you've had a lot of involvement in, what we look at as corporate wellness programs. And we've seen a lot of corporate wellness programs, largely because employers have started, this has been going on for a while now, that they've seen that the health of their employee, both the mental and physical health of the employee is actually so important, to the organization. And you've been involved in a lot of these programs. So, if you had to look at your crystal ball and say, you're going to have more and more people working from home now, how is that going to change the corporate wellness landscape, in your opinion? Fully realizing there's still going to be office jobs for some people. But I think that there's going to be a lot of people who from now on are probably going to be spending most of the time working from home. So how does that change corporate wellness? And what do you think employers are going to be doing?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's the reality now, and I would say for at least the next 6 months going forward, if not longer. And it's a continuation of the trend right now in terms of trying to provide remote support as much as possible, because you no longer have that central hub at the workplace. At Rogers, we actually have 2 full medical clinics at 2 different facilities with medical staff, doctors, nurses, and all that, but physios. But that's just not a particular option right now. And if it's a national company as well, there's really no other choice but to resort to virtual care, which can be very, very impactful, and which I found firsthand. But many insurers are actually doing that right now in terms of setting up almost like walk-in clinics for physician visits for their employees, all remotely.
Now we've heard from Rachel, a couple of the strategies that she uses and that she's found helpful. Would you have anything to add there, or perhaps, perhaps anything else that you can think of that people could be doing who are finding that, that the process of being isolated from coworkers, not being able to leave the house, etc. Perhaps even the stress of having to work from home when you have kids and you've got a cat and you've got, maybe your partner sitting next to you, also trying to get work done. You've got homeschooling going on. You've got all of these things. What's your advice to someone who's finding that they're just simply being overwhelmed by the situation?
You have to kind of plan it. And I see this all the time. If I do a virtual call, employees and Rachel is right completely. It seems that workers are spending many, many more hours working on their computer at home than they ever did on site. But we have to kind of remember that even previous to the pandemic, many workers were working at home, at work, then taking their work home for many hours as well. It's the isolation and the uncertainty, because we don't know what's happening week to week, and that uncertainty drives the stressors and inflammation as well. In terms of at home, what I usually recommend to my patients is that they've got to get up and start moving, because they're molding into the shape of chairs right now in terms of they're sitting way too long. And being sedentary and being isolated are 2 strikes in terms of the stress strike zone, so to speak. All right. So if we can get them moving, and if I can get them focusing on a little bit more aerobic activity, trying to get more blood into their tissues, and that's where barometric treatments kind of came into being, because if you can get more oxygen into the person, you also reduce their inflammation levels. Their brain can function at a higher level because your brain needs so much oxygen content. So I tell them you have to get up, even plan on your calendar to take specific breaks. When you're trying to juggle kids at home in terms of homeschooling at the same time, so difficult. And hopefully with two parents at home, they can kind of, partner up and see if they can divvy up those challenges a little bit better. But that's difficult, but it's reality of today.
Yeah. So now, before we open the floor up to questions, just from your perspective, as an organization, Obesity Canada, obviously its central topic is helping people living with obesity to live better, and attain better health. But what do you think in a situation like this is the role of an organization like Obesity Canada, both in the area of corporate wellness, but also in helping people living with obesity at times like this to, I don't want to say survive, but do the best they can. Where do you see the role for an organization like Obesity Canada? What should we be doing?
Well, I believe that organizations would benefit from input from many different points of view. And obesity is a huge problem in North America right now. And in terms of health and wellness, there's so much that organizations can do and that organizations like Obesity Canada can provide, especially with respect to patient-centered care, training practitioners on a standard of care for treating obese patients would be terrific. And even as I mentioned before, with respect to remote care, I think it would be very deliverable in terms of the ability to have an impact on nutrition, obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes. It can be done on a virtual scale, so why not?
Okay. So Rachel, for you, the question, you've also been involved in Obesity Canada now for several years, and you're certainly one of the persons who's made a huge difference, in the Toronto area. But as you also know, Obesity Canada will soon be releasing new clinical practice guidelines for obesity management. And you, as someone who's been living with obesity for a long time, what would you like to see happen with those guidelines, and how do you think they're going to make a difference?
I think it will make a huge difference. In fact, thankfully, I've always felt in a position where I could advocate for myself, and I can question the things that maybe sometimes if I go to a doctor and I have a particular condition, I can question, I can challenge what they're saying to me in a very respectful way. And I've actually found that I've had several situations in the past where I educate, a family practitioner on Obesity Canada, and, you should go check them out and learn more about them, and they can really help you with your patients. So I think with respect to these clinical practical guidelines that are coming out, I think it's really important that it's not only that that's used to influence the healthcare provider, but also, as patients, we should be familiar with what that is, because as patients, I think more and more we need to feel empowered, but not only empowered, actually entitled to better healthcare. And I think that's really important. And, this initiative for these guidelines is really going a long way to help us get closer to that, to a place where we do feel entitled to that kind of healthcare.
Okay, so thank you both, Rachel and Derek, for these insights. And what I'd like to do now is hand back to Sandra, who's been busy, screening the chat box, where I can see there's a lot of questions there. And we open the floor. We've got about 20 or 30 minutes to take your questions, and so let's get right into it.
Yes. So you have a couple of ways of asking a question. If you hit the participant button, which is at the bottom middle screen, and find your name, you'll be able to locate a drop-down menu beside your name and virtually raise your hand. If you're not able to find that easily or quickly, just have your video on and then raise your hand the old-fashioned way, and I'll see you. Video can be found at the bottom left-hand corner. And also you can type it, but know that the live questions will take preference. Before you ask your question, please introduce yourself. Let us know where you're from, what your work is, and we'll get started. So Stephen, you have your hand up. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Hi, Stephen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen, a family doctor with special interest in obesity medicine from Malaysia. So my first question will be to Dr. Lee, and the second question will be to Rachel. Dr. Lee, Just want to clarify, are you still practicing as a chiropractor and acupuncturist?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so what would be the role of a complete medicine practitioner like yourself in managing obesity in this stressful period? And for Rachel, what will be your weight target in this time of stress? Do you consider yourself successful in achieving your weight management target in this stressful period? All right, thank you.
I guess I'll go first. As a chiropractor and acupuncturist, in terms of the corporate environment, I do work with the medical staff in terms of if any kind of reports, et cetera, need to be requested. But my approach is primarily trying to manage stress from an inflammation point of view. And there's a tremendous amount of tools that are well researched in terms of trying to lower inflammation levels. Because once you do that, you just drop the baseline for a person to be able to manage stress and manage chronic illness in general. At these particular times with the pandemic, stress is much worse. The uncertainty levels are higher, but the tools remain the same. If you can just manage it that way, then things are quite straightforward to produce results with. Thank you.
And Stephen, I think what you were asking me was, what are my weight management targets? And have I had difficulty in doing that over the last little while? I would say that, my key target is actually having peace with food. So I identify as a food addict. And so I've spent a lot of time figuring out how can I be peaceful with the food and not be eating things that, trigger me to want more and more of that highly processed food. So actually, let me use an example. I actually have a bunch of friends who've not necessarily struggled with weight their entire life like I have. And what I've been finding is that for those individuals, they're actually the people that are coming to me and saying, wow, I've gained a whole bunch of weight through this. And my response is, I actually haven't. I've been perfectly fine throughout this whole thing, I think, because I've spent so much time figuring out how do I attain that target of peace with food. And once I got there, then a lot of those things just really became habits. And also because I was used to working from home, this hasn't really been a challenge for me. But let me be honest though with you, I have had potato chips for food for a meal once or twice throughout this, because this whole idea of pandemic food buying, it just really opened up, the idea that, oh, I could have potato chips in my home. But I learned that wasn't a good idea.
But Rachel, what I'm hearing from you is that when we talk about targets and goals, your focus is not on your weight. Your focus is on the actual behavior. So as you said, your goal is not to achieve a certain weight, but your goal seems to be, here are certain rules I want to follow in terms of my food intake. And I want food to be my friend and not my enemy. And that's what you're kind of working on. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the whole thing. Like I said, I do strategy for a living. So I applied, a strategy to how I live with food. And that's about looking at targets that are not tied to a number on a scale. It's looking at targets that are tied to a way of being. So I actually have a system for how I want to eat and how I want to practice healthy behaviors in my life.
Yeah, which is very much in line with what with the notion that Obesity Canada has always championed, to say that, weight management is not the goal of obesity management. They're two very different things.
Yeah.
And that, yes, sometimes weight loss might be necessary to improve, health and quality of life, but you can get a lot of bang for your buck with very little weight loss. And really, weight loss goals and weight loss targets is probably not exactly where we want to go. We want to have behavioral goals. So thanks very much for that comment. Back to you, Sandra. Or Sandra, you yourself, do you have any comments before another question?
I just have to kind of laugh at the potato chips. Potato chips are manufactured so that you will eat the entire bag. Like, it's no contest. If they're in your home, you're gonna eat them all. I've yet to meet somebody who can have a handful. And we chuckle at it, but the truth is, it's really, really challenging. So sometimes I think Rachel's strategy is so smart. Sometimes it's just easier not having the enemy in the house. So I have a question in the chat box. It's from Diane. So I have fibromyalgia, and I am normally busy nearly every day. I find that being home all the time, I have symptoms that I don't normally have. Could this be due to stress? I'm not feeling stressed, but I am having, but am I having stress without? And if Diane would like to also, add some commentary to that, feel free to unmute yourself to have a richer conversation.
So the question is about fibromyalgia, and so we've got a perfect question here for you, Derek, because fibromyalgia, it's one of those mysterious conditions where we don't fully understand what causes it. But one thing is for sure, we are talking about inflammation, and we're talking about the relationship between physical activity, because the one thing that does help with fibromyalgia is being active. So what's your take on that, and what's your advice?
I think you just summed up everything there. Well, fibromyalgia is almost like a cluster of symptoms, tender points, irritable bowel syndrome, and with the chronic inflammation. If you're going to become sedentary, then that's going to increase inflammation levels. If you're not moving around, it's going to increase inflammation levels. So movement completely is spot on for those individuals, not excessive inflammation. You can actually go to the complete opposite direction. I have patients who, they're hardcore gym rats in the gym 5 days a week, 7 days a week, super exerting themselves all day. So that's almost as bad as in terms of producing inflammation levels. They always come in with chronic aches and pains and other inflammatory disorders. So with fibromyalgia, you just have to move, but you move in a sense that it's not too aggressive for your system, and it's within your limits. Because once again, additionally, fibromyalgia patients also suffer from chronic fatigue. And if you overdo it, do something too much, burn out your energy reserves, you're going to pay for it because you'll flatten for the next 2 days as you start to recover. So rest is great, better sleep, but movement for sure.
Okay. All right, Rachel. Anything to add to that?
I'm not familiar with the condition itself, but I definitely am not someone who is considered a gym rat at all. So I think for myself, like with respect to handling stress, it's actually kind of the slower walking. So not feeling like I need to be in the gym, running on the treadmill, but really just actually being in nature, I find as being really helpful as well. So being active, but then additionally being in nature, I feel like is another plus.
Yeah, and you just made a very important point that I always tell my patients and say that, when you look at the role of exercise or physical activity in obesity management, it's never about burning calories. It's always about enjoyment. Mm-hmm. So, I often say if exercise is helping you work up an appetite, you need to cut back. Because that's not the goal of exercise, and if being physically active is not making you happy, well, then it's the wrong type of activity and you should look for something else, right? So you've just made that point beautifully, that you said that, sometimes even just walking where you're not burning a lot of calories, it's not about burning calories, right? It's about making sure that your stress is better, you feel better about yourself, and all those benefits. So thanks for making that point and reminding us all that the goal of exercise is not to try to burn off as many calories as possible, but really to get all these other improvements and benefits. So back to you, Sandra. Do we have more questions?
I couldn't agree more. I always say I'm too old to do stuff I don't enjoy. And if I don't enjoy it, I'm not doing it. And that includes exercise. So we have a question from RuPaul. I have a query for Dr. Lee. Since you specialize in acupuncture, how are the results of acupuncture in obesity? Has it been shown to have an effect on weight management?
Well, that's a great question. And right now, the research is indicating that it's a little bit variable. I would use acupuncture as an additional tool on top of everything else. It's not going to be typically the home run that some people associate with the acupuncture. And the way the acupuncture works is it's basically a reset of the brain, because acupuncture is a neurological technique. And if an area is inflamed or irritated, the acupuncture can reduce that irritation, reduce that spasm quite rapidly, almost instantaneously. But you use that in addition to other tools like exercise, nutrition, targeted supplementation, and stress adaptogens, these type of things to work as a complete package. You can't just do one without the others.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you right, you don't go to the acupuncturist because you're trying to drop 40 or 50 pounds. Isn't it true? I mean, I've always found it very interesting that acupuncture, one of the areas where I think acupuncture is used quite often is actually in smoking cessation. And again, what you're doing there is you're going after addiction and, as you said, neurobiology of smoking, nicotine addiction ultimately, by I would say sticking a needle somewhere in your body. So is that a similar model that you would think that it's not so much about losing weight, but it might actually help people eat better?
Yes, and oftentimes it's treating the stress through the acupuncture as well. It's not so much targeting, yes, your cravings, or it's not targeting the nicotine addiction or the food addiction, so to speak. It's calming the brain so that when you add on other elements of the program to it, then it's much more of a holistic approach in general. But just doing the acupuncture alone, to me, it's just not going to get the results a person might be looking for.
Okay. All right, back to you, Sandra.
Yeah, another question in the chat box from Lisa. What are the tools to manage inflammation? How can we learn more?
Great question again. And you can handle inflammation in multitude of ways. And what I often do with complex chronic patients is that you have to take an inventory of the possible inflammation fires that are popping up all through their system. So for instance, if their inflammation is being driven by high stress levels, that's something you have to deal with, putting on your list. If it's more a chronic viral infection, maybe they have an issue with canker sores, cold sores, if they have digestive issues in terms of H. pylori infections, urinary tract infections, upper respiratory tract infections. These are all small fires in the body that are lighting up inflammation and driving those levels. So if you can manage those issues and douse those fires one at a time in a prioritized manner, you can make a huge impact in terms of their inflammation levels and stress levels overall. So that's how I kind of approach it in my practice, putting out one fire at a time, and adding to that is, before we touched on oxygenation of the body to reduce inflammation levels. We talk about nutrition in terms of trying to, I usually call it caloric modesty, carbohydrate modesty. You don't remove them completely because it has to be reasonable, right? We talk about avoiding pancreas-associated lectin-containing foods like wheat, mushrooms, kidney beans, boosting the immune system, trying to avoid gluten and dairy, of course, and dairy produces a lot of mucus in your system as well. So there are lots of different tools you can use to douse those fires over time.
So one of the chronic stressors, of course, is chronic pain, which unfortunately is not uncommon in someone who's living with obesity. I mean, whether this goes all the way from plantar fasciitis to pains in your knees and your back and your neck, and funnily enough, there's actually even a relationship between obesity and headaches and migraines. So what's your short answer for someone living with chronic pain? Where do you start? Where do you find help?
Great question again. And with chronic pain, the driver is the same thing. It's inflammation, right? And I wish there was a short answer, but basically, if the person has uncontrolled inflammation production, and that can be due to a virus or bacteria that hasn't been completely squashed, or it can be an overreaction to a previous infection or a pathogen, then you have to deal with dousing the inflammation. Whether that means going back, finding where the virus is being harbored, if you're reducing the bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, those are the areas you have to target. You have to suppress the inflammation, and that's what's going to reduce their chronic pain considerably. Now, chronic pain, it's a chronic illness, and we're not saying we can cure it, but the whole point is to manage it, stop the flare-ups, reduce the magnitude of the flare-ups, and lengthen the time between the flare-ups.
Okay, so thanks so much for that perspective. I can see that there's a lot more questions in the chat box that we haven't got around to answering, but I'll give it back to you, Sandra. I mean, I would like to just take the opportunity of thanking, of course, you, Rachel, Derek, for taking the time out and being here to answer the questions. I'd like to thank the entire audience, for taking the time to attend this. If anybody wants to know more about Obesity Canada, the organization, and all of the different things that it does in terms of supporting patients, supporting people living with obesity, advocating for better care, a lot of the advocacy work that happens with Obesity Canada, and of course, an essential part of this is making sure that we also get answers from all of the researchers working in this important field. Please visit the website of Obesity Canada. You can follow us on social media. And with that, it's back to you, Sandra, for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Obesity Canada is a charity, and so if you would like to support our work in patient advocacy and also in our clinical practice guidelines, please donate. There'll be a link in the chat box coming up right now. And we also have opportunities to sponsor the HOPE series. This is an international community. If you want to be a part of this conversation, if you want to help get the message out, please look into the various levels of sponsorship that are available. We're also going to ask you to fill out a survey, which will be in the link. And lastly, I want to tell you about our next event coming up. Next week is a holiday week for Canadians and US, so we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back on Thursday, July 16th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And Dr. Arya Sharma will be hosting as usual, and we will have Dr. Peter Shelby, professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and Psychiatry at CAMH. So we hope to see you there. The topic next week will be on the 16th, not next week, on the 16th, how are we helping to treat addiction during the COVID-19 pandemic? So with that, I will say goodbye, and I wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and we'll see you again on the 16th. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.